Picture a family in Germany in the winter of 1923. They are cold. The temperature outside is below freezing, and they need to heat the room. They reach for fuel, but they do not reach for wood. They reach for money, actual paper money, stacked on the table beside the stove, fed into the flames note by note. Not because they are making a political statement, not because they are wealthy enough to be eccentric, because the arithmetic of their situation is unavoidable. The paper currency in their hands is worth less than the wood it would cost to buy with it. Burning the money is the rational choice. This is not a metaphor. This is not a rhetorical device. This is a documented event from the most catastrophic episode of currency destruction in modern European history. It is the image that captures, better than any graph or table of exchange rates, what happens when a government loses control of its own money. When the trust that makes currency function, the collective agreement that this piece of paper represents real value, breaks down completely. When the paper becomes, in the most literal sense, just paper. This is the story of the Weimar Republic's hyperinflation. It is a story about economics, but it is also a story about something deeper, about what happens to a society when the financial contract between a government and its people is broken so completely that the people stop believing in any contract at all, and about how that broken faith, left without honest answers, became the fuel for one of the most destructive political movements in history. To understand how Germany arrived at a point where a wheelbarrow of cash could not buy a loaf of bread, you have to go back to where the financial damage began. Not to 1923, to 1914, to the decision that Germany, like every major power that entered the First World War, made at the very beginning, to finance the conflict not through taxation but through debt. The German government bet everything on a short war. The generals promised it would be over by Christmas. The economists calculated that the empire could not sustain a prolonged industrial conflict without collapsing financially. The plan was a rapid victory, followed by a peace that would extract reparations from the defeated parties and allow Germany to repay its war loans from the proceeds. It was a financial strategy as much as a military one. Win fast, pay the debt from the winnings, and the books would balance. The war was not short. It lasted 4 years and cost more than anyone had planned for in any scenario. Germany financed it by printing money and issuing war bonds. The war bonds were sold on the promise of repayment after victory. The printed money inflated the currency gradually through the war years, though the government worked hard to suppress the visible signs of that inflation through price controls and rationing. By the time the armistice came in November 1918, Germany had lost the war, held enormous internal debt, and was sitting on a currency that had already been significantly weakened by 4 years of emergency monetary expansion. Then came the Treaty of Versailles, and if the war had wounded the German financial system, the treaty was designed to ensure it could not easily recover. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, assigned Germany full legal responsibility for the war and all its consequences. One sentence with infinite financial implications. Because once you have accepted full legal responsibility, the question of how much you owe is no longer a matter of negotiation. It is arithmetic, and the Allied Reparations Commission was convened to do that arithmetic. In 1921, they delivered their answer, 132 billion gold marks. For a country whose entire annual economic output before the war had been roughly 45 billion marks, this was a figure that bore no realistic relationship to any payment schedule that the German economy could actually sustain. The nations demanding payment had simultaneously stripped Germany of its most productive industrial territories, confiscated its merchant fleet, seized its overseas assets, and imposed trade restrictions that limited its capacity to earn the foreign currency it would need to service the debt. You have taken everything they had that could be used to repay you, and then you handed them a bill for everything they owed. Germany tried to pay. It had no realistic choice but to try, because the consequences of non-payment were occupation and the resumption of a naval blockade that had already caused severe hardship to the civilian population during the war. But the structural trap was severe. To pay reparations denominated in gold, Germany needed foreign currency. To earn foreign currency, Germany needed to export. But its industrial capacity had been weakened, its markets disrupted, its most productive regions placed under Allied control or occupation. The legitimate path to generating the revenue required to service the debt had been systematically narrowed by the same treaty that imposed the debt. The crisis that produced the hyperinflation came to a head in 1923. Germany had fallen behind on reparations payments, particularly on deliveries of timber and coal. France and Belgium, frustrated by the defaults, sent troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, the region of coal mines and steel mills and factories that represented the productive engine of the economy. The stated purpose was to extract reparations directly through the physical control of production. German workers in the Ruhr, supported by their government, went on strike rather than work under occupation. The government called it patriotic resistance. The economists called it the point of no return, because strikes mean no production. No production means no revenue. And the German government had promised to continue paying the wages of the striking workers, to support them in their resistance, to demonstrate that Germany would not simply hand over its industrial capacity to foreign troops. The only way to pay those wages, and to continue funding a government that had no functional tax base equal to its obligations, was to print money. So the presses ran, not cautiously, not at the margins. Day and night, around the clock, producing paper currency at a rate that had no precedent in the history of any major economy. The exchange rate figures from this period read like a sequence from a nightmare that keeps accelerating. Before the war, 4 German marks would buy 1 United States dollar. By 1921, it took 75. By January 1923, 7,000. By July, 160,000. By August, 1 million. And by November 1923, at the peak of the crisis, the exchange rate had reached 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. 4,200 billion marks for $1. The number is so large, it stops functioning as a number. It becomes something else, a symbol of a system that has lost all connection between its monetary instruments and the reality they are supposed to represent. If nobody has ever explained to you that the Weimar hyperinflation was not an accident or an act of nature, but a consequence of specific, traceable decisions made under specific political and financial pressures, subscribe now, because understanding how a currency collapses and who pays the price when it does is one of the most important things you can know about how economies and societies actually work. Stay with us. The lived experience of hyperinflation in Germany in 1923 produced a series of images and stories that have remained embedded in historical memory precisely because they capture something true about what extreme currency failure actually feels like from the inside. Workers stopped accepting weekly wages and demanded to be paid twice a day, sometimes more, because the money that was worth something in the morning was worth measurably less by the afternoon. The rational response to holding currency that is losing value by the hour is to spend it immediately on anything before it loses more. So people ran from their workplaces directly to shops and markets and bought whatever they could find, not because they needed it, not because they had rationally assessed their consumption requirements, but because converting paper into anything physical was better than holding paper that was actively evaporating. Restaurants removed printed menus from their tables because by the time the menu was printed, the prices were already outdated. A customer who ordered coffee at the price listed when they sat down might be handed a bill for double that amount 30 minutes later when they finished drinking it. This was not a misprint or an error. It was simply the speed at which prices were moving. The social conventions of commercial life, that a price quoted is a price that holds, that the menu reflects what you will be charged, that the number on the label bears a stable relationship to the number in your pocket, all of these conventions broke down because they depended on a stability that no longer existed. The wheelbarrow has become the defining image of the Weimar hyperinflation, and it earned that status. By late 1923, a loaf of bread cost hundreds of billions of marks. Moving enough currency to purchase basic groceries required transporting physical volumes of paper that could not fit in a wallet or even a large bag. People used wheelbarrows, laundry baskets, suitcases, any container large enough to hold the physical mass of paper required for ordinary transactions. The story that circulated, and that was probably true in at least some versions, was of a man who parked his wheelbarrow outside a shop, went inside briefly, and returned to find that someone had stolen the wheelbarrow and left the currency behind in a pile on the pavement. The thief had calculated correctly. The container was worth more than its contents. Hyperinflation does not distribute its damage evenly across a society. It operates more like a targeted mechanism, one that falls with particular severity on specific groups while leaving others relatively protected or even actively advantaged. Understanding who benefits and who is destroyed by inflation is essential to understanding why the Weimar episode left the specific political scars it did. The people who held physical assets, land, factories, machinery, durable goods, foreign currency accounts, were largely protected from the inflation and in some cases actively benefited from it. Debt, denominated in marks, became worthless. A mortgage that would have taken 20 years to repay could, at the peak of the inflation, be settled with a week's wages. Business owners who had borrowed heavily to acquire physical assets found that their debts had evaporated while their assets retained real value. They became known in Germany at the time as the inflation kings, men who had understood or been fortunate enough to benefit from the mechanism by which an inflation transfers wealth from creditors to debtors, from the patient savers to the leveraged buyers. While some held celebratory dinners, others were selling furniture to cover the cost of bread. The people who were destroyed were those whose wealth existed in financial form. Bank savings, life insurance policies, pension entitlements, war bonds purchased by ordinary citizens who had been told it was their patriotic duty to lend money to the government and who now discovered that the government had repaid their loyalty by printing the value out of the currency their repayment was denominated in. The doctor who had spent 30 years accumulating a retirement fund woke one morning to discover that he could not buy a single cup of coffee. The schoolteacher whose modest savings represented decades of careful living found that they were worth nothing. The war veteran who had invested his savings in government bonds in 1914, believing he was supporting his country, found that his country had effectively taken his savings without acknowledgement and without compensation. This was not bad luck. It was not an economic accident. It was the consequence of specific policy decisions made by specific people under specific pressures. And the cost of those decisions was concentrated almost entirely on the group that had done nothing wrong. The professional middle class, the doctors, teachers, civil servants, small business owners, pensioners, had done everything they were supposed to do. Saved responsibly, trusted the institutions, invested in the national project. And the national project had vaporized their savings. The injustice of this burned into the consciousness of an entire generation and left a scar that financial recovery could not heal, because the wound was not financial. It was about trust, about the relationship between a government and the people who had believed in it. The hyperinflation ended in November 1923 with a speed that was almost as disorienting as the speed of its acceleration. The government introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed theoretically by a mortgage on the land and productive assets of Germany. The technical details of the backing were never entirely coherent. The actual mechanism by which you could redeem a Rentenmark for agricultural land was never made fully operational. But the key insight of the Rentenmark's designers was that the currency did not need to be technically sound in every detail. It needed to be believed. It needed to feel different from the paper that had just been destroyed. It needed to provide a psychological break from the previous system that was clean and definitive enough for people to treat it as a genuine new beginning. It worked. Confidence returned with remarkable speed. Prices stabilized. The presses slowed and stopped. The absurdities of the inflation period, the wheelbarrows, the twice-daily wage payments, the menus revised by the hour, ended. The economy began to function again. And the lesson embedded in this recovery was one of the most important findings in the entire history of monetary economics. Currency is, at its foundation, a collective act of belief. It works when enough people simultaneously agree that it represents real value. When that agreement is intact, the money functions. When it breaks, the money ceases to function regardless of what it is technically backed by. And when new agreement can be established, even on the basis of a somewhat improvised arrangement like the Rentenmark, the money can function again. But while the hyperinflation ended in 1923, the damage it had produced did not end with it. The Weimar Republic stabilized. The Golden Twenties brought a period of relative prosperity to Germany's cities. The economy recovered sufficiently that by the mid-1920s, with American credit flowing in under the Dawes Plan, Germany looked from the outside like a functioning modern society. The surface had healed, the deeper wound had not. The generation that had lived through the hyperinflation carried forward a set of experiences and conclusions that could not be undone by subsequent recovery. The trust in institutions that a stable society requires, trust in banks, in government, in the currency, in the basic good faith of the financial system, had been broken in a way that economic improvement could not fully repair. The middle class that had been most thoroughly destroyed by the inflation had learned the most dangerous possible lesson, that playing by the rules, trusting the system, saving responsibly, investing in institutions, all of this could be rendered meaningless by decisions made above your head by people who would not bear the consequences. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929 and American loans were recalled and German unemployment exploded from 1.3 million to over 6 million in the space of 3 years, the psychological infrastructure that might have held the society together through that crisis had already been weakened. The trust was already gone. The faith in institutions was already broken. What replaced it, in the minds of the specific demographic that the hyperinflation had most thoroughly destroyed, the professional middle class, with its evaporated savings and its shattered sense of the relationship between responsible behavior and material security, was a receptiveness to simple explanations and certain voices. A man appeared. He was loud and certain and angry. He had answers that were simple and specific and pointed blame in a clear direction. He promised order. He promised that the humiliation was over. He promised that the people who had taken everything from the German middle class would be identified and held responsible. He was catastrophically wrong about who those people were, but he was correct that the middle class had been financially destroyed. And the people who had been financially destroyed and who had been given no honest account of how or why were ready to believe anyone who told them it was someone else's fault. The hyperinflation did not cause what followed in German politics in the early 1930s. The direct cause was the Great Depression and the unemployment it produced. But the hyperinflation had done something to the society that made the Depression's political consequences so severe. It had pre-destroyed the trust. It had already broken the relationship between the middle class and the institutions of the Republic. It had dug the hole. The Depression filled it. And the political movement that emerged from that combination of prior trauma and fresh catastrophe came for everyone, including the people who had designed the Versailles reparations that had set the mechanism in motion. The hyperinflation was not an accident. It was the end product of a chain that ran from the decision to finance the war through debt, through the peace treaty that made the debt unpayable, through the occupation that triggered the final collapse. If this changed how you understand the relationship between financial policy and political catastrophe, share it and subscribe, because the chain we follow today is still the template. The story of the Weimar hyperinflation carries lessons that extend far beyond Germany in the 1920s. The most important is the one about trust. A currency is not a piece of paper. It is an agreement, a promise made by a government to its people and maintained through the consistent, transparent, accountable management of that promise over time. The moment a government begins breaking that promise, printing money beyond what the productive economy can absorb, creating inflation that transfers wealth from savers to debtors without acknowledgement, telling people that the value in their pockets is stable when the evidence of their daily lives says otherwise, it is not just making a monetary error. It is corroding the foundation of something far more important than the exchange rate. The Rentenmark worked because a new agreement was established. But the old agreement, the one that had been broken, did not come back with the new currency. The people who had trusted and been betrayed remembered. They passed the memory to their children. The scar remained active in German financial culture for generations, expressed in a deep institutional commitment to price stability and an aversion to inflation that shaped the Bundesbank's character for decades and continues to shape the European central bank's approach today. Germany's particular relationship with inflation is not arbitrary. It is the direct institutional inheritance of what happened in 1923. You can print money. You cannot print the trust that gives money its meaning. You can restore currency by introducing a new one and creating a new agreement. You cannot restore the relationship with the people whose trust was broken by the old one. That restoration, if it comes at all, comes slowly and partially and never completely. The family burning money in the winter of 1923 was not just staying warm. They were living proof of the most fundamental truth in all of monetary economics. The moment the paper stops meaning something, it stops being money. And the damage done to the people who believed in it does not end when the paper finds its value again. History does not repeat, but it returns to the same verse. When people lose faith in money, they look for something else to believe in. The question that every society in every era has to answer is, what will that something else be? And the time to think carefully about that question is before the answer arrives. History is not over. It is underwritten.